John Neal, a police constable in J Division Bethnal Green of the London Metropolitan Police and a fine specimen of an Irishman from County Cork, was making his regular beat through the streets of Whitechapel in the early hours of Friday the 31st of August 1888 when he made a horrifying discovery. Whitechapel, as the newspapers remarked at the time, was not blessed with an abundance of lampposts and gaslights. These, of course, were reserved for the more affluent neighbourhoods, busier thoroughfares and spots in the Warrenist district where work went on through the night, at breweries, slaughterhouses and that sort of thing. In the poorer residential streets and lanes, the darkness was miasmic and near total. Coming from Whitechapel High Street through Court Street, Neal paced into the chthonic blackout of Bucks Row, an opening leading into a cavernous passage in the gloom cast between the towering buildings of Essex Wharf and the Board School. On his right, there was a decent glow spilling out from Winthrop Street, where some lads were working away in the Harrison Barber & Co. horse slaughterer's yard, and where, just out of view, a night watchman sat warming himself by a small brazier. On the other side of the school building, however, it was a different story. This stretch of Bucks Row had two small mounted gaslights, but only one of them, the one on the warehouse wall further towards Brady Street, was working. There was a lamp on the corner of Brady Street, but its light was entirely blocked by the Roebuck public house on the corner. P.C. Neal walked through the sash of light from Winthrop Street, casting a long shadow behind him, and continued on over the cobbles toward the north side of the school building. Mounting the pavement, he turned the corner and walked on past the school into the pitch darkness of a row of tradesmen's houses. But before he reached the first of these houses, the new cottage, he was met by a large obstacle sprawled out in the gateway of Brown's stable yard. Rough sleepers were not uncommon on these streets, but he had passed up this way half an hour earlier, and other than the horse slaughterers, there was not a soul about. There were a few people still out on the Whitechapel Road, coffee vendors, a handful of prostitutes or unfortunates making their way home. It would be rare indeed that anyone would be loitering about streets like Bucks Row at this time. Most people were aware of the criminality associated with the depths of Whitechapel and Spitalfields. Not only the sex trade, but the ladies' bullies and the high rip gangs. It would take a brave vagrant to settle down up here for a kip. His bull's-eye lantern would shed some light on the question. Illuminated in the ring of light it cast, just at his own feet, were the feet of a woman, attached to her legs indecently uncovered to the knees. Her unnatural posture alerted the policeman to the fact that not all was well in this situation. Moving the light up along her body, he could see her left hand awkwardly moved off to the side and almost touching the wooden gate of the stable yard. To her right there was a black straw hat with a velvet ribbon, and under her chin was a god-awful sight. Her throat had been cut from ear to ear, and blood was oozing out of the wound and running into a spreading, dark puddle on the ground. Neal would certainly not have been unused to violent crime. Stabbings, slashings, and all kinds of violent assault were a feature of London's underbelly, especially in the East End. Yet in spite of this, murder was not entirely common. The violent murder of women, on the street, that is, was less common. Brutal assaults, like what he had just discovered, were all but unheard of. Except, that is, there had been two similar crimes this year already in the area. One in April, and the other only a couple of weeks before, a short walk away in George Yard Buildings. Blasting his J. Hudson & Co. Metropolitan whistle at 3:45 in the morning would do him no favours. This would only notify the whole neighbourhood to what all and sundry would only treat as a gruesome spectacle. No doubt he was listening carefully for any sign of the killer, but when he heard the boots of another constable passing on Brady Street, Neal flashed his lantern in that direction to signal him. Within a minute, John Thane, Neal's colleague from Bethnal Green Station, was with him, taking in the disturbing sight. Time was getting on, coppers were already knocking workers up for their work. Soon, there would be a steadily increasing procession of tradesmen and carters traipsing up and down the street. Neil told P.C. Thane to leg it round to Whitechapel Road to Dr. Llewellyn's surgery and bring him round. No sooner had Thane disappeared around the corner than one of H Division's boys rocked up from the other side of the row, from down Baker Street way. Neil sent him off to the station to fetch an ambulance, a canvas-covered stretcher on wheels, with which to convey the body to the Whitechapel Union Mortuary on Old Montague Street. Neil was not alone with the body for long, however. The lads in the slaughterhouse on Winthrop Street soon got wind of what had happened around the corner and dropped round for a good old gawk. It would be handy to keep these fellas about, however. For one thing, they were all now suspects. For another, it would be useful to have some sturdy working men close by in the event the guilty party, the person or persons unknown, made an appearance. There were some hard characters on these streets. Some streets, like Dorset Street nearby, were places where tough characters made a sport out of pummelling coppers. Not suggesting the big Corkman was a coward, but safety in numbers is a good policy no matter who you are. Before too long, John Thane arrived back with the doctor, and Neil could finally relax a little. Llewellyn, after taking a look over the body, determined she was dead. You don't say, Sherlock. And that she had died not any longer than half an hour before, at about the time John Neil had found her. We can only imagine now this nugget of information quite unsettled P.C. Neil. Sure, when he found her arms to be quite warm, but he was no medical man. The murderer may have very well still been hiding in a dark corner of Box Row. Neil saw no one as he came into Box Row. The workers on Winthrop Street saw and heard nothing suspicious. There was even a night watchman round that way. There was a constable stationed in the rail yard, and a live-in caretaker and his wife in Essex Wharf overlooking the crime scene. No one heard a peep. No one saw anyone. When the Whitechapel bobby arrived back with the ambulance, Llewellyn ordered the woman's body removed from the scene to the mortuary. The policemen, on lifting the woman, discovered a fair bit more blood beneath her body, all soaked into her clothing. By this time, doors were being knocked. The widow in the new cottage, Mrs. Green, said she had slept in the upstairs front room with her daughter immediately above where the woman was. Neither she nor her daughter were awoken by any sound, and she added to this that she was a light sleeper. At about this time, James Green, one of Mrs. Green's two sons living in the new cottage, came out and washed the blood away with a pail of water. When Inspector Spratling, also of J Division, was informed of the incident on Hackney Road at about 4:30, he made his way to Box Row directly. Speaking to Mr. Purkis, the caretaker in Essex Wharf, he learned Purkis was asleep in the room overlooking the spot on the other side of the narrow street. Purkis heard nothing, but he added that his wife was awake, that she was up and walking around the room. She heard nothing in the street below. This beggared belief. Might she have been killed somewhere else and her body dumped at the stable yard gate? Not likely. There were no wheel marks and no one heard a cart or trap. The constable in the rail yard was questioned. He was unaware of anything untoward happening. Spratling, a Sergeant Godley and P.C. Thane made a thorough search of the adjoining railway yards and found nothing of any interest. No murder weapon was recovered. No track marks were left. No one saw or heard anyone on the street, or any indication of a struggle. In fact, the killer had made a getaway without leaving a single trace. Little did PC John Neil know, however, that when he arrived into Box Row, the body of the woman had already been discovered by two local carters on their way to work. Nothing of this came to light until Lloyd's weekly newspaper published a remarkable statement on Sunday the 2nd of September. This statement was made by a certain Robert Paul, a Carman for Covent Garden Market, on the afternoon of the murder when Mr. Paul himself was walking home from work. back through Box Row. According to Paul, it was exactly 3:15 when he was walking through Box Row. In the darkness, he made out the shape of a man standing at the stable yard gate where the dead woman's body was lying, and this man gave him the creeps. As a local, living not 5 minutes' walk from the spot, Paul understood this was a dangerous area. He tried to give this other man a wide berth, and the Star newspaper tells that Paul suspected the other geezer was going to attack him, but as it turned out, this other man was a good 'un. He touched Robert and asked him to come over and see that there was a woman lying in front of the gate, and sure, there was. Mr. Paul never saw any blood, but it was very dark. He felt the body, and it was warmish, and he thought he felt her breathing. As he was running late for work, however, the two men decided to leave the scene together and inform the first policeman they happened across on their way. The other man had thought the body was an old tarpaulin, but when he found it was a woman, he loitered about the scene alone in the dark without raising the alarm for about 8 minutes until Paul arrived. He did not come forward to the authorities until after Robert Paul's statement was published in Lloyd's Weekly, 3 days after the murder. When they left the scene and found a policeman, PC Jonas Misen, the H Division copper Neil sent for the ambulance, this man approached the bobby alone and lied to him, saying another policeman wanted him on Box Row. He did not inform Misen that he thought the woman was dead. Then, at the inquest, he lied about what he had told Jonas Misen, and he appears to have given a false name. Later, on the day of the murder, to get back to our main story, Inspector Spratling arrived at the mortuary on Old Montague Street to examine the body before Dr. Rhys Llewellyn began his post-mortem examination, and on turning up her clothing, he was shocked to find she had been disemboweled, and the doctor was immediately sent for. The attendant of the mortuary, an inmate of the Whitechapel and Spitalfields Union workhouse, and his mate had been instructed not to touch the body, but they had gone ahead and stripped her, throwing her torn clothes out and onto a pile in the yard. It was at this point it was discovered that her petticoats were the property of Lambeth Workhouse. With all of this information and the publicity of the murder in the press, it was not long before the victim was identified as Mary Ann Nichols, a 42-year-old woman who had recently been residing at White House Common Lodging House, 56 Flower and Dean Street. Polly, as she was known to her friends, had separated from her husband a number of years before and had developed a chronic alcohol problem. When her husband learned that she had taken up with another man, he stopped supporting her, and she quickly fell down the social hole into the hell of destitution in Whitechapel. Like so many other people in her position, she drifted between the workhouse and the casual ward, making a living however she could, and often, as it was for many women and girls in her situation, this meant engaging in casual prostitution. Her night's doss was 4p, and without it she had only the cold street or the workhouse. Polly did what she could to survive, and from the few recollections we have of her, she seems to have weathered it with spirit. Of all the Ripper's victims, Polly is the one who stands out to me. Her existence was hard, make no bones about it. But from what was remembered of her last hours, we get the impression of a cocky little woman with an often inebriated but indomitable soul. On the night before her murder, she was seen making her way up the Whitechapel Road, where we know she ended up in the Frying Pan pub on Brick Lane. Whatever money she had earned that day, and it wasn't only by prostitution, she was determined to blow it in the pub, and she surely did. Everyone who saw her that night after closing time testified to her being 3 sheets to the wind. After midnight, she stumbled out of the Frying Pan and staggered to her lodgings, knowing well she had spent her lodging money on drink. But she chanced her arm and perched herself in the kitchen of the lodging house, where she sat and warmed herself a while. About an hour later the deputy came around, collecting the night's money, which of course she did not have, and she was turned out. Even now, 135 years on, it is enraging, even with the homeless crisis we still have, that this woman, this poor wee soul, was denied a night's safety for the sake of fourpence. But that's what happened, and true to form, she upped and left the house with words denying defeat. "I'll soon get my DOS money. See what a jolly bonnet I've got now." At some point the day before, she had treated herself to a hat, a black straw bonnet with a black velvet band. She was want of a few teeth, that is true, but she was quite certain this new jolly bonnet would catch the eye of a gentleman out looking for the business in Whitechapel. So sadly, this was the same straw bonnet PC Neal saw by the side of Nichols as she lay dead in front of Brown's stable yard door on Bucks Row. Sometime about 2:30 in the morning, Emily Holland, a friend, saw Polly walking alone down Osborne Street and stopped her for a chat. Mrs. Holland said at the inquest into Polly's death that she was very much worse for the drink. Now, the intelligent viewer will recognise this is a relative statement. Being worse for the drink is a context-dependent description. We might laugh at Grandma for being worse for the drink after she's had a few too many sherries or creme liqueurs at Christmas. It means something else entirely, describing a character like Mary Ann Nichols. We get the distinct impression she had a little too little blood in her alcohol stream that night. She had been hard at it all day, migrating from public house to public house until it was well past bedtime and she stumbled into her friend Emily. Emily tried to persuade her to come back with her to her own lodgings at 18 Thrall Street, where Polly had been staying for a while in the recent past. But Polly was for none of it. She had made up her mind, and she was going to continue on under her own steam to the Whitechapel Road, where she would earn her own DOS. She was last seen alive shortly before 3 o'clock in the morning, making her way along Whitechapel High Street in the direction of Bucks Row. All we know now is that she finished up on Bucks Row, where she met her cruel end. She was a poor creature who did no harm to anyone according to them that knew her. She deserved nothing of what happened to her. A poor soul on the very lowest rung of a cold Victorian caste system, who met the very worst kind of death at the hands of the very worst kind of man. She was buried on the 6th of September, 2 days before her killer struck again. On that morning her body was removed from the mortuary in Old Montague Street to the undertaker's on Hanbury Street. Thousands gathered on Hanbury Street to pay their respects, and so the undertaker was forced to play a trick. A hearse was pulled out of the yard by a pair of horses and the crowd set off behind it, but this hearse only made its way down Hanbury Street before doubling back along the Whitechapel Road and back to the undertaker's. While the crowd was thus preoccupied, another hearse left with Polly's coffin, followed by a small number of mourners. As her coffin passed through the streets, all the blinds were drawn, and there was a profound public outpouring of sympathy. She was laid to rest that day in the City of London Cemetery, Aldersbrook Road, and there is a plaque to her memory there, still. May you rest in peace, Polly. Good night, and God bless.